I finally became a pothead. Get it? Pot. Head.
Gaggles of pots and pans. That's what we're talking about today. Different pots, different pans, and what they're for. Because every pan, just like knives or spoons or anything else, there's always a particular idea in mind. It's not haphazard as to how these things are put together. Let's start with the basics, the difference between a pot and a pan. Pot. Pan. Okay. First thing that you'll notice is that there is quite a difference in the height. Not necessarily, it doesn't really matter how big either one is. What matters is the depth of the pan or the pot to indicate what it's for. Pots are generally made to hold a volume, generally of liquid. So you make soups and stews and things like that in a pot, whereas a pan is made, whether you're talking about a large, say, cookie sheet or whether you're talking about a frying pan like this, the idea is to have a large surface that it distributes heat evenly so that your food contacts the heat source and cooks that way by direct heat transfer. With a pot, the transfer of heat goes to, say, the liquid volume and then to the rest of the food, chicken or potatoes or whatever else you got in there. The heat penetrates through the medium of whatever the pot is containing, whereas the pan has direct heat to the transfer to your food. So generally pans have large flat surfaces that allow you to cook directly on them. And you'll hear a lot sometimes about, whether you're talking about pots or pans, about the thickness of the bottom, etc. And that has to do with how the heat is distributed. If you have a very thin piece of metal, mostly the heat is going to go directly from, you have your heat source here and you have your metal here. It's not going to distribute this way very much. It's going to go right up from here. So you're going to end up with a very hot spot right underneath the burner, and then generally colder spots to the outside. With a thicker bottom, however, the heat comes into the bottom and it begins to distribute through the bottom metal, and then it will then proceed to your food, and so you end up with more evenly distributed heat, so you end up with a larger, evenly heated surface in order to work with. Okay, so yeah, the thickness of the bottom is important. It's not all determinate, but it is an important factor in how the heat is distributed. For instance, if you have this pan versus this pan, this is made out of cast iron, so it is going to be more distributive because the heavy, thicker bottom here is going to distribute the heat more evenly than it would, say, in this pan. So if you're dealing with something that really depends upon that, if it's a large piece of meat, for instance, you don't want it all to get cooked in the center and then still have gray spots or undone spots on the outside. You want to make sure the whole thing gets cooked. And that comes to the issue of materials. There are whole kinds of different materials, but generally most pots and pans are made out of today either out of cast iron or out of stainless steel, mostly. Okay, you will have some specialty surfaces. For instance, this pot has a copper lining to it, but it's not a copper pot. Okay, you don't want to cook generally in copper. You can do copper bottoms, but they are generally coated with stainless steel. And if you don't have that covering, the copper will actually penetrate into your food and poison the food. Copper is poisonous, so we don't make pans out of copper generally. So you want to have a thicker stainless steel bottom if you're going to distribute heat evenly. The cast iron, usually in and of itself, is appropriate for distributing heat. Cast iron is very good. It can be breakable. You have to learn how to care for this pan. It is non-stick, believe it or not. You don't need non-stick coatings to have a non-stick pan. You season this by putting oil into it and putting it in the oven and cooking at a very high heat, and the heat actually will penetrate into the cast iron and create a non-stick coating. So this can be made very non-stick if you know how to deal with it. But also, you never want to do things like you never want to put detergent in your cast ironware, because the detergent will also penetrate and you end up cooking things that taste like soap. That's not a good deal. You also have to be careful about temperature. Okay? If you shock this, temperature shock is over. If you have it on the stove and you got it all hot or whatever, and you put it directly under a cold stream of water, you could easily crack this pot back to the pan. So you're going to want to be careful with how you treat this particular material, the cast iron. All right, so what's the difference between they're frying pans, right? Well, yes, but this technically is a sauteuse. This is a sautoir. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, you take a look at this, and the first point, you have this gentle sloping curve to the sauteuse. Okay, whereas this one, you have a sharp angle, and it's reflected also inside the same thing, gentle sloping, sharp angle. Why? This pan is designed for, there's a large surface for like cooking your chicken or your pork chop or whatever you're going to cook in it, okay, and then making a sauce in it. Because when you put something in, you're going to do what's called reduction, and you're going to cook and simmer that sauce for a little while so it actually goes down and begins to thicken and concentrate. And you're going to stir it, and you'll notice that the curve fits the curve of a wooden spoon. That is so you don't get stuff stuck in the corner of the pan and let it burn. So you have to like turn this on an angle and sort of dig around in this corner in this pan, whereas this pan, you know that if, as you go around, you are going to get all the stuff out of the corners, because there are no corners, and you're going to hopefully not burn your sauce. This is made simply basically for frying. You have this structure to give you the even just that little bit extra maximum amount of space to put your eggs or whatever it is you're frying directly onto the surface. So this is made specifically for just frying a product like a pork chops or whatever, and then flipping it and maybe some oil in there, but you're not necessarily going to make a sauce in here, whereas with this one, you make a sauce and you can make it right into the pan and it will hopefully not burn. So again, a design feature that is specifically put into different kinds of pans. There's also differences, for instance, in size. You get this little guy who is Teflon coated. I generally keep my Teflon coatings for eggs and things of that sort, small things, breakfast items usually, simply because working with Teflon can be a real pain, because you can't use metal implements, you have to use wood or itself, so you don't scratch this surface off. So if you keep it mainly just for eggs things that sort of, it works great because the egg won't stick. But if you try to do that much else with Teflon pans, I don't necessarily recommend it. Plus, it's also difficult with a nonstick pan to develop what is called a fond. And we'll learn about that more when we get into cooking proper. A fond is that stuff that develops when you're frying something and you get that brown, crinkly stuff that really tastes really good underneath on the pan, and then you want to scrape that off or deglaze it off. And you don't get that nearly as well, in my opinion, with a non-stick surface. So if you want to develop a good fond, if you want a good flavor in your, for instance, your meat or whatever, you're going to want to stick with non-coated, non-stick pan, sticky pans. I don't care what it's called. Anyway, but if you want to use this tiny little guy, it's great for if you do an egg and you wanted, for instance, to have an English muffin. You want to make an English muffin or bagel sandwich. You make the egg up in here, and it comes out. It's the perfect size for your English muffin or your bagel. And so choose your pan size appropriately for whatever application you're using. You want to make sure that you use the volume of the pan, because you can actually scorch or burn a pan, and you get a pan that will begin smoking. So you want to have the food, when it hits it, cools the pan and helps control the temperature of the pan so it doesn't get too hot. So you want a pan that is large enough to hold whatever it is you're making, but not too large such that you end up with this tiny little thing in the middle of this really big pan. So we'll go over, and as we're doing more actual cooking, we'll talk about pan size versus, because you don't want to overload the pan either. Because once you overload a pan, it cools down too much, and then you're not cooking whatever it is you want properly. All right, so let's move on to different kinds of pots. Okay, so this is a basic soup pot, basic pot for making soup, stew, etc. It holds a medium volume of liquid. You notice it's not too high, as opposed to, well, okay, say this one. This is a stock pot with a pasta insert. You see the bottom has holes in it. When you put boiling water in here, you put your pasta in, and then when your pasta's done, you pull it out. It drains, and that way you don't have to necessarily use a colander. So, that's a handy little thing. But in general, this shape is a stock pot. It's higher. It's about the same size, just a little bit bigger, but it's much taller. Why is that? Well, when you're doing a stock, you are actually trying to preserve the liquid. That's what you're doing it for. You put your chicken, your vegetables, and everything, and you strain those out, and what you want is the liquid. And so the idea of a stock pot is to preserve as much of the liquid as you can. As the steam comes up, it begins to cool, and at around this level, it will begin to collapse back in on itself. It begins to cool down and then go right back down. So you don't have as much evaporation as you would with, say, a pan or a pot this size. So again, it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to actually achieve, say, cooking a piece of corned beef or something, or just holding some soup and some stew, then this will do fine. But if you actually need to preserve the liquid, you want to preserve the liquid, you want something a little taller so that the liquid is contained and continues to fall back down into pots. So different kinds of pots. Then there are a whole bunch of specialty pots that do all kinds of different things, like the pasta pot. Let's see, where else can you go? Okay, you were there. For instance, you would have this one, which is it can go into the oven, so it doubles as being able to go on the stovetop and go into the oven at the the same time, how can you tell that? Well, take a look at this handle. This handle is made out of metal, and so the metal is perfectly fine to go into the oven. This one is plastic. See that plastic handle? You can't put that into the oven. So you don't want to confuse the two. If you're going to be making a preparation, you're going to do something on the stovetop, and then you're going to put it in the oven. You want to make sure that you have metal as a handle, as opposed to plastic, which will obviously melt, and it really stinks when you put it into the oven. But you got this pan, for instance, it has a special coating, a copper coating. It's a non-stick thing. It's a nice lid. So this is a good general all-around pot. I will say one thing that I have with this square shape is it's very difficult to pour anything out. If you have to like pour something out, you have to sort of pour it on an angle with the corner, and that gets a little awkward. So, but as I use those pans quite a bit, they're good pans, good pots, pans, pots, whatever. Same. And then you've got something like this. Like this, which is a steamer basket. You put the water in down here, and then this fits into the top, and you can see how it's got these little holes all through it that allows the steam to come up and cook whatever you've got in here, and so you've got a little steam basket there. So that is a specialty pot that can be converted into a steamer. Stock pots come in very different sizes. This is a small stock pot. This is, my daughter gave this one to me. Cute little smaller stock pot. You notice that it's higher in the size than just a general pot about the same size. Yeah. So that also is a stock pot. And now, let's see, roasting pan. This is a roasting pan for cooking the Thanksgiving turkey. It goes the oblong shape, and it has a lid, and so that is specifically for putting it in the oven and roasting. We've got things like cookie sheets. Cookie sheets are pans, because you put your cookie dough on here, and then you the direct contact with the heat cooks the cookie. Okay, and again, there's very, very shallow depth, and so that's ovenware. Cake pan, same thing, same principle. You're going to have your batter is going to directly contact the surface and cook in this pan. And the idea, we'll see that generally cooking, you're only doing one thing. You're driving off moisture. And so when you got a batter, you want to drive off that moisture. And but with a stock, you're trying to preserve the moisture. So again, it depends on what you're trying to do with what you're cooking. So there are a whole bunch of pots, pans, sorted things. This is a wok. This is a special pan to us, but it is the common pan that is used throughout Asia. And the idea of a wok is, you'll notice that you have this sort of rounded shape, and it has to sit in a container, else it's just going to sit there and roll around. So you have it on a stand as you cook it. And the idea is to concentrate the heat in the center, and then it slowly dissipates until you get up to here where it's much cooler. And so you're going to do most of your cooking in this band right here, and you're going to allow moisture or water to collect down here, and it's going to evaporate very quickly. Which is why you do things like stir fry, etc. And the idea is to have the heat down here. You could also put, say, oil in here, and you want to pull your your meat or whatever it is you're cooking in the oil through the oil where it's at the hottest spot in the pan. And that is the principle of a wok. Various materials that show up in woks. This happens to be a stamped stainless steel wok. It's the lightest one that I have, so I wanted, so I have it here. But love to have a cast iron one, because then that distributes the heat a little bit more evenly, but you still have that hot spot in the center. So, various materials, but they use these throughout all Asia. It uses this as the standard pan that is used in a different area of the world. So we have all kinds of different materials, different designs. Learn what your pots and pans are best at, sometimes by experimentation, sometimes just by looking it up. But use the appropriate pan, appropriate size, appropriate material, appropriate shape for whatever it is that you're cooking. Gadgets we're going to do next. For instance, do you know why we cook with wooden spoons as opposed to metal spoons? This is for cooking. This one, out of metal, is made for serving. Why? What's the difference? We'll go over gadgets next.